interrupt me and tell me to like go over something again or cover something again. Okay, we're recording. And can you guys see that M3 draft? You guys can see my screen, the PowerPoint, the M3 draft strategies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yes.
So nice to hear people's voices. So what I wanted to do today with the workshop is kind of, like I said, it's a little bit of a review in the sense that, you know, we've talked a lot about these structures already, but I think what I'm going to try to do with this thing is give, what I am trying to do with this is sort of trying to encapsulate things so we can visualize how this process works and hopefully sort of streamline our process of writing these essays. So one of the things that is to keep the purpose of these papers in mind. And a lot of these ideas and these lessons come from conversations that I've had with students recently, and also comes from sort of things that came to mind as I was reading through people's RD2s. So we want to remember that we're doing two things in these papers, right? It's a unique genre of paper that we're writing in this class. I talked a little bit about last time about critical analysis, but it's important to remember that we're doing analysis and argument, right? And so I just pulled a couple quick definitions to sort of refresh our perspective on this, that analysis is the process of separating something into its constituent elements and examining those elements as a basis for an interpretation, right? Now with argument, to make an argument is to provide interpretations of evidence in support of an idea, action, or theory, typically with the aim of persuading others to share one's view. Now, so the core gist of this is that to analyze something means to break it up into different elements and interpret them, right? That's kind of language that hopefully we recognize. You've been hearing me say the word elements all semester long, and I'm sure you want to dunk me in a cold bucket of water if you hear me say it again, but I'll say it again and again. So elements is one of the key things. The argument is where we take those interpretations, our analysis, and make, well, an argument. And that argument is based on our perspective on something. So just to give you sort of a concrete example, when we were dealing with our last essay, let's say I was writing my paper on, you know, the Black Panther Party. I'm not only analyzing what the Black Panther Party did, or how they, you know, the style they used, or the protests they put on, or the education program. I'm not only analyzing the different elements and interpreting those elements in terms of what I think they did in terms of social issue. I'm also making an argument about why I think the Black Panthers were important, or are important, or why there's a significance to this, to talk about this in our own society. So let me sort of like slow this down a little bit and make it a little more pragmatic. So with analysis, we are dealing with the elements of something and interpreting those. So the focus is the something, right? I've been asking you to choose some sort of focus from our culture. So the first module, you chose a particular new narrative. So you could have run, you know, like Gloriana wrote about Mulan. You know, I talk a lot about The Little Mermaid as possible focus, right? So then I want to take that focus and I break it down into different elements, right? So you know, if I was writing about The Little Mermaid, I'm going to break it down into discrete elements. So particular scenes, particular moments of dialogue. So, you know, I talked about like the scene where Little Mermaid, where Ariel gives up her voice, the scene where she, let's say, finally gets into the castle after marrying whatever his name is, Prince Eric or whatever his name is, right? Maybe I also want to talk about the scene where she has the conversation with her father, Triton or whatever. So I take my focus and I pull out as many elements as I can that I think I want to write about. Now, the idea here, now we talked about this before. The idea is that particularly early on, I'm probably not quite sure what I'm going to argue yet. I mean, I probably have some sense. I'm going to talk about the issue of like feminine empowerment or female gender identity in relation to Little Mermaid. But to start, I'm going to try and pull out as many elements as I can so I have enough material to work with. Ultimately, when we're dealing with the scope of a 4 to 5 page paper, double spaced, we're talking that I'm only going to probably need 3, 4, maybe 5 elements, right? I only need, each support paragraph should focus on a specific element. So the other part of analysis here is, so I mean, just to give you a sense, like this past weekend, I was watching a movie with my wife and was sort of thinking like, oh, I actually might want to write about this movie. So as I sat there, as we were watching that movie, I started taking notes, and all I was doing was writing down the different scenes, the different moments of dialogue, the different sort of symbols or imagery that came up, the music, the sound, whatever. I was just listing as many things as I could, not saying to myself like, oh, I'm going to write about every single one of these things. But now that I have that long list of elements, I now say like, oh, I'm going to pull out this element and this element and this element according to what I think is most applicable to whatever argument I'm making. So the other part of analysis is that it's not just dissecting something, it's also interpreting it. So you recognize this. This is what our subclaims are all about. Our subclaims are all about analysis. Our central claim, as we'll see, is all about argument. Subclaims are all about analysis. Subclaims have 2 things in them, right? They have elements and analytical points, right? So that's what's happening here. So I'm going to take each of these elements, right? The scene where Ariel confronts her father. I'm going to make an analytical point. I'm going to interpret that thing in a particular way. Element 2, the scene where Ariel is talking to or gives her voice to Ursula. I'm going to make an analytical point about that scene. Finally, the scene of Prince Eric and Ariel's marriage or whatever, I don't know, when she's at the castle. Been a long time since I've seen that movie, but I'm going to make an analytical point about that. The important thing that why I bring this up is that the stuff that's in orange are the facts. They're what's there, right? The scene where Ariel confronts her father. Nobody can deny that that scene is there. That's a fact. What I think that scene means, right? Or what message I feel that scene is sending is up to me. That's my interpretation. So subclaims are both part fact and part your interpretation, right? Now with argument, it's about my perspective, right? So you've heard me say in my comments and feedback on your various papers, like the larger argument, connect this analysis back to the larger argument, or that your central claim represents your overall position, excuse me, and perspective on the sort of impact and consequence of something, right? So, you've heard me say it. I was making an argument about The Little Mermaid that I feel like it's really sort of, it sort of is pushing women or young girls into these very traditional and dependent gender roles. That's my theory. That's my argument overall about The Little Mermaid. That's not a fact about The Little Mermaid. That's my argument, right? But there's another part of this. So all my analytical points relate to this overall point I'm trying to make, this overall argument I'm trying to make. But there's another part to this, which is, you'll notice here it says, with the aim of persuading others. Now, I want to add a caveat here, because we're not writing persuasive essays per se, which is to say, right, persuasive essays are usually essays that, where you're talking about a particular, like, sort of two-sided debate about something, right? I'm going to persuade you as to why, right, abortion should be legalized, or I'm going to persuade you as to why abortion should be banned. We're not really persuading something in the sense that we want them to we want to win an argument. Instead, what we're doing with these papers is actually developing a sense of teaching, using our argument so that it teaches the reader something, or audience, something about themselves or about our society in relation to a social issue. So by writing a paper about the Black Panthers and analyzing the Black Panthers, part of my argument should be have some sense of significance. Why is this important for us to learn about this? What do the Black Panthers teach us about racism in our society, or racial empowerment, or whatever it might be, right? So that's where the social relevance comes in. So to sort of streamline this, you have the analysis, which is about your subclaims, and it's about your focus, right? That's why I'm telling you, you've got to have a focus in these papers. So the focus is the specific something you're writing about. So like in my last Zoom workshop, I talked about like, well, maybe, it's a lot easier for me to write about the Broadway show Rent than it is for me to write about the focus of theater in general. Theater in general for the scope of a 4 to 5 page paper is way too broad, way too broad. But the other way I can focus things down is in terms of the issue. And the issue is what brings relevance and significance to your arguments. Because gender, race, class, family, relationships, love, violence, war, politics, whatever it might be, whatever the social issue might be, that is something that we all live with, right? So it is the social aspect. It is what connects your reader to your argument. Your reader might not care about The Little Mermaid or have ever even seen The Little Mermaid. But since I'm making an argument that relates to how we understand gender issues and femininity and feminine empowerment, that's the goal. They're interested. They're going to be interested. It's going to have meaning for them. So that's that part of the argument that we want to make sure we understand. It's not only presenting your opinion on something, your perspective on something, it's also showing how that opinion has value for us understanding something about the social issue, our society, or ourselves. Okay, let's try and let me give you some examples of this stuff so maybe it'll come a little clearer. I'm going to stick with this focus of The Devil is Fine, a song by Zeal and Ardor. Let's just say I'm writing my paper, or I am writing an article about this. It's actually probably going to be much longer than it's going to be like a 20, 25 page article. But for the purposes of this is also the example that I use in the central claim worksheet that's on Canvas. So I'm going to stick with this example. You don't need to know what the song is or what it sounds like or who Zeal and Ardor are. It's just a song by a band. They're a hard rock, hardcore band, heavy metal band, whatever you want to call them. Okay. So as I told you, as I talked about already, this first part is all about analysis. It's all about subclaims, right? We notice from my subclaims, I need to have an element in each one and an analytical point in each one. All right, so it should be a different subclaim for each of my analysis paragraphs. That's why I was saying you're probably going to have 3 or 4 different subclaims in these papers, because you're going to have 3 or 4 different analysis paragraphs depending. So here's the subclaim from my Devil is Fine analysis, right? The religious iconography in the Devil is Fine music video criticizes the way that Christian teachings were frequently used to justify slavery and the oppression of African Americans. So if I analyze this, I have a clear element. That's a specific thing, a fact that I'm analyzing about the song, or in this case, the music video for the song. And that there's religious iconography in the video. That's a fact. That's what's there, okay? But I also am interpreting it, right? I am saying what I think this means. So I feel like what this does is it criticizes the way that Christian teachings were frequently used to justify slavery and the oppression of African Americans. So I'm making my own point. That's my interpretation. Somebody else could look at that religious iconography in the video and say something totally different. They could interpret it in a totally different way. I'm obviously going to interpret it in a way that serves my argument, right? So let me look at a couple examples of subclaims that don't quite fulfill that and why that's a problem. So let's say this was another subclaim. The Devil is Fine uses heavy metal style distortion and double bass. If you wrote a subclaim like this in one of your papers, I would have written a comment here saying, like, we have a clear element here, right? Heavy metal style distortion and double bass is something that is part of that song, but we don't have an analytical point. So what? What do you feel? How do you interpret that? What do you think that means? So we lack the analytical point in that subclaim. So it's incomplete. Conversely, another problem is we have a tendency, sometimes we can sort of write subclaims without a specific element. So I make a good point, but I'm not connecting it to something specific in the song. We empathize with the struggles and suffering of having one's culture and identity stolen. Okay, well, what part of the song or the music video does that, creates that effect? Sorry, my cat is invading space. So I don't have a clear element there. Whoa, 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 whoa. All right, we got interrupted by the animal. Sorry, guys. Let me go back. Okay, so I don't have a clear element there, right? It's not a focused element. It's not connected to a piece of or specific element of the song. Now, one thing you would say is like, well, Rick, I actually connect to this idea of the sort of angry tone of the song later in that empathize paragraph. So I am connecting to a part of the song. Well, that's great. And that's a good point. But we want to make sure that element is in the subclaim. And this is not just because, this isn't just because it's some rule that, you know, was bestowed upon us by a higher power. Subclaims are function, they have a function, right? It's a structural and organizational function. For one way, they have a function for us. They're good, they're helpful for us as writers to organize our ideas. Okay, in this paragraph, I'm going to focus in on the religious iconography, and I'm going to make this point about criticizing the way religion was used to justify slavery. Okay, that's my focus and purpose in this paragraph. For the reader, it sort of does something similar, except it's when we talked about this in class, but it's something where the reader knows right from the first sentence or first two sentences exactly what this paragraph is going to be about. It's going to focus in on the religious iconography, and it's going to, and exactly what the point it's trying to make. It's going to make this point about criticizing the way Christian teaching. Okay. So for the reader, the subclaim is crucial because they know right from the start of the paragraph what is the focus of that paragraph and what is the purpose, what is the element, what's the analytical point. That way, your reader isn't, because you know in your head when you're writing what you're trying to say. You know, you're going to talk about the tone and da-da-da. But when your reader's reading through that paragraph without a subclaim, they're saying, what do you, okay, you're talking about empathy, but where's this empathy coming from? Or, you know, so you want to have that subclaim right at the start of each of your support paragraphs. Now, let me give you some more examples of subclaims and ways that things that I've seen happen that are common. And these aren't things to be sort of like whatever regretful about. This is just what happens when we write. So let's look at this. I'm going to read quickly through this series of subclaims. So the religious iconography in the Devil is Fine music video criticizes the oppression of African Americans. Next support paragraph. The Devil is Fine uses heavy metal style distortion and double bass to criticize the oppression against African Americans. Okay, next paragraph. Another thing that criticizes African American oppression is the use of work song rhythms. Notice that this is gets highly repetitive. Yes, we have distinct elements and analytical points in both of these things, but if you notice, I shouldn't say analytical points. We don't have distinct analytical points. We have the same analytical point throughout. Now, the problem with that is that the analysis doesn't get into any kind of depth and doesn't have any kind of progression from idea to idea, right? Your reader sort of says to themselves, okay, let me guess, this criticizes African American oppression, and this does too, and everything criticizes African American oppression, right? I'm not getting to enough progressive and diverse ideas in my analysis for it to have any kind of effectiveness. I'm not doing the real analytical work of interpreting these things in different ways. So one thing to be careful of is you don't want to just have the same idea in each of my analytical points. I need to be more specific and more distinct with those analytical points. I was trying to sort of explain this to in conversation with a student, and the one way I described it, and maybe isn't the best example, but I was like, let's say you meet somebody for the for the first time, and you guys are like sitting down having coffee, or you're in a job interview, right? And somebody asks you this question, so tell me about yourself, right? What am I going to do in order to answer that question? Tell me about yourself. Well, I'm going to probably select elements of my life, right? So let's say I choose to tell, because, you know, I'm not going to make this person sit through an hour-long, you know, conversation of me talking about myself, you know, particularly in a job interview. So I'm going to sort of point out the elements that I think are most important, like that I grew up in California, that I'm a college professor, and that I'm a father and husband, okay? Those are three things that maybe I want to bring up because I feel they're particularly pertinent to what I want to sort of say myself or represent myself as. Those three things, right, don't all shape me in the same way, right? Here's the dog again, I'm sorry. I don't know why we're having similar doorbell rings, my apologies. Those three things don't shape me in all the same way, right? Being a father, like I want to make a different point about that. Well, I feel like being a father and a husband has taught me to be humble. It's made me a better communicator, okay? Being a college professor, what do I feel like that? How does that shape me? Well, that has made me try and empathize with people and care about learning and responsibility or something. I don't know. Then growing up in California, maybe that taught me how it's important to sort of try and stay mellow and relaxed in your attitude and keep your stress levels low. So I'm going to have these three different points that I'm making because those three different elements don't all do the same thing. Um, and then I'm going to sort of present an argument of who I am. So I feel like this makes me a kind of sort of well-balanced, well-rounded person. I'm not trying to stroke my own ego here, sorry, but you get my point. The idea is that I want to be making distinct analyses in relation to my three different elements. So here's the subclaims that I have in my paper. The religious iconography in The Devil is Fine music video criticizes the way that Christian teachings were frequently used to justify slavery. The Devil is Fine uses heavy metal style distortion and double bass to get us to empathize with the anger and struggle of having your identity stripped from you. The work song and blues-based vocals pay tribute to the creative and expressive power that African Americans utilized to strive through slavery and oppression. Now, all of these analytical points are related to a larger idea of racism and slavery and oppression, but they each make distinct analytical points. Okay, so that brings us to what an argument does, and obviously the central claim is the part of our essays that lays out the argument. We've talked a lot about central claims, and there's multiple worksheets, and I did a whole Zoom workshop on central claims. So I'm not going to move through this relatively quickly, but I want to sort of talk about it in light of what we just talked about in relation to these elements and in light of the subclaims. So the difference between message and impact and consequence hopefully can clarify here. So I'm going to ask myself, what do I think is the overall message or impact of my focus on a social issue? So for me, what do I think is the overall message of the song "The Devil is Fine" on racism or oppression or slavery? So I have all my analytical points, right? But I don't want to just create a central claim where I just throw all those analytical points in there for two reasons. One, my central claim is going to be really long, and it's going to be like pedantic, which is to say, I'm going to say zeal, the devil is fine by zeal and ardor, criticizes the justification of slavery by religion, empathizes with the anger and struggle of African Americans in slavery, and pays tribute to the expressive power. So one reason why is it makes the sentence really long and very pedantic. It's very list-like. But the more important reason you don't want to just list all your analytical points or your elements in your central claim is that it doesn't allow for your argument to have that kind of encapsulating process. Your argument is supposed to represent your whole sort of theory, what this all adds up to. And therefore it connects all your different analytical points together, right? So it serves as that kind of through line for all the different points you're making. So all of this adds up to my argument, right? So I need to somehow, that's so you can see those three arrows next to analytical point at the bottom of the screen, they're all sort of folding in down into the argument. So I'm going to try and find a concept or think up a concept or have an idea, develop an idea that I feel captures all these ideas on the left, my analytical points. Let's say I feel like the overall message of the song then to me is that The Devil is Fine is demanding that we recognize our racist history in this society, okay? So the message or impact is what you feel that thing, your focus, is doing in relation to a social issue, or what impact it's having on the social issue, okay? Now the consequence of that is, what do I think are the consequences of that for us or our society in relation to that social issue? So what is the consequence of this song getting us to recognize our racist history? Well, let's say I decide that inspires us to fight against racism in ourselves. So the message or the impact is what I feel the focus is doing or how it's impacting the social issue. The consequence is what it gets us to do, what that gets us to do. Now, there's a third part of this, of course, which is the significance, right? So remember, this is the part about that social relevance. This is the part where you need to tell your reader why it's important we learn this. What does this teach us about ourselves or our society overall? What is the significance of this? I've made my argument about what I think the song is doing and what I think the consequences are of what the song is doing. Now, why does this matter? Well, Maybe this will allow us to achieve a more democratic and equal society. So that's the larger argument there. That's the larger significance, the social relevance. So my central claim for the paper, zeal and ardor's devil is fine, there's the focus, sends a powerful message to our racially divided society to recognize the racist history of our country. There's the message. What's the consequence of that? Ultimately, this will allow us to realize racial biases in ourselves so we can fight against them. That's the consequence. And why is this important in terms of a larger perspective? Why does this have relevance or significance to my reader or society for a more democratic and equal society? So there's my focus, there's my message and consequence, and there's my significance. Now, obviously, it takes time to develop all those things. It's not like it happens in the flash of a pan. But you can see how this central claim has that sense of cogency. And what is meant by cogency is that it's not just a list of all the points I'm going to make, right? Cogency means it's showing how there's an overall argument, an overall point that I'm making that connects all of my different analytic interpretations. So instead of saying Zeal and Ardor's song through the, through its tone and through its heavy metal double bass and through its religious iconography allows us to criticize the way religion was used. I mean, I'm not going to lay out it's not a roadmap of my entire analysis. That's not what a central claim is. A central claim is a representation of my argument that shows how all my analysis relates to this one argumentative idea and how that argumentative idea has a larger significance for us. Easier said than done, obviously, but that's kind of a nutshell version. Now, one last thing. One last thing here, just one more slide after this slide. One last thing I want to do with this, though, is I want to talk a little bit about introductions, right? So a lot of people feel that the job of an introduction is just to introduce the focus of your paper. So that I would write my introduction, so I'm just introducing Zeal and Ardor and their song and like the band. I don't know this information actually, so let me put an asterisk next to this. So I would like introduce like, oh, maybe they formed in Texas and blah, blah, blah. They were originally called, some other name. And then they all, it consists of a bass player and a guitarist and another guitarist and a drummer and blah, blah, blah. The job of an introduction is not simply to introduce the focus and then give a bunch of background information, particularly if that background information doesn't really matter to the argument. Right? The fact that Zeal and Ardor was formed in Texas and blah, blah, blah has nothing to do with my argument about how the song is resisting getting us to fight against racism, right? If it does, then I should include it. Let's say I find out that the Zeal and Ardor's lead singer, who's African-American, let's say I find out Zeal and Ardor's lead singer has like talked about in an interview how his ancestors were slaves. And so then that seems, okay, well, that's kind of applies to what I'm talking about. So I'll bring in that piece of background. So our introduction, though, for the most part, is doing more than just introducing the focus of the paper. In fact, what it really is doing, most importantly, is establishing the social problem or the social situation that you feel your focus is intervening within. Sorry, my cat's popping in here again. Cats and dogs and children and wives, one wife is out of control. So it establishes and that's what that word context comes from. So if I look at what my central claim is doing, it can kind of inform what my introduction should do, right? I mean, it should not only introduce the issue I'm talking about, so racism in our society, racism, slavery, racial oppression. It should also set up the context around that issue. What is the scene? What's going on in terms of racism in our society, or what is the racism in our history? And it should also introduce the focus, of course. And finally, it should end in the central claim. So we know all that, but we tend to in some cases, we don't want to just introduce the focus and then connect to a central claim. We need to connect that, we need to set up the issue of racism in our society. We need to set up the context of our society in terms of what's going on in terms of racism. So if I look at the actual central claim, my issue is clear. It's racism, racial bias, okay? I also give some clues as to what I should be setting up in my introduction with a number of phrases I have in here. I mentioned in the central claim that we live in a racially divided society. That's obviously my interpretation, my feeling. So I'm going to put that in the introduction and explain that, right? That's part of the context of my argument. That's going to allow this to relate to my reader. I also say that, obviously, by saying that we need to recognize the racist history of our country, I'm implying that we don't do a good job of that we don't take enough stock, we don't take enough time in thinking about how this country was founded due to chattel slavery, or largely in part due to chattel slavery, the success of this country, the initial success of this country. I also imply here that we're not as democratic and equal as we'd like to think we are, right? So if democracy means equal power amongst all people, and equality means, you know, everybody is on a level playing field, I don't think we have that equality. So those are the contexts that I need to set up in my introduction, because those are the things that really my argument is about. Yes, my argument is focused in on Zeal and Ardor's Devil is Fine song, but in terms of the significance and relevance of this, I'm really making an argument through an analysis of the song about how we should be thinking about racism differently, and how that'll help us perhaps achieve democracy and more equality in our society. So I'm also going to obviously introduce the focus as well in my introduction, because I don't want it just to suddenly come up in my central claim. I need to show how it's part of this whole equation in my introduction. So I want to give you a fair warning here. My next slide, I want to take a look at an example introduction. And this is the last slide. My next slide, though, is a completely white screen to start. So the screen's going to get very bright. So avert your eyes or squint or something. I just want to give you a fair warning that the screen's going to go from a black background to a white background, and it's going to be bright. Okay, I'm changing it now. Okay, so I wanted to pull an introduction from our last essay that was a particularly effective introduction. And I wanted to pull this out so it demonstrates what I'm talking about, how introductions, the job of an introduction is much more than introducing the focus. The job of an introduction is setting up the issue and the context around that issue. So this is a paper on flappers subculture, which is a group, you've probably heard of them before, from the 1920s. Well, you'll get it if you haven't heard of them before. You're about to find out about them. So I'll just read through this, and then I'll talk a little bit about it, and then we'll wrap up. The Roaring '20s was a decade of growth, change, and prosperity. World War I had just come to an end, taking the lives of hundreds of thousands of young men who fought in the war. Though the war was finally over, the idea of death loomed over the vast majority of the American youth. This caused an overwhelming feeling of life being too short, which in turn resulted in the idea to live life to the fullest. Thus, a new chapter of life began for many young Americans, specifically women. Traditional feminine gender norms that restricted women's beauty, sexuality, and independence were being broken left and right, all in good fun. Not only did the decade begin with the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, but, quote, by 1929, more than a quarter of all women and more than half of single women were gainfully employed. Young women began to stray away from marrying young and becoming stay-at-home mothers. Rather, these young women started wearing controversial clothing, embracing heavy makeup, shopped incessantly, stopped refraining from partying, fearlessly smoked in public, and even partook in drinking alcohol during Prohibition. While these actions may seem typical and casual now for modern young women, in the 1920s, these women began to be labeled as flappers. According to critic Claire Sorrow from 16th century British slang, the term flap was originally used to describe a young prostitute, but later on was used to describe girls that were unladylike. During their time, most viewed flappers as promiscuous young ladies. However, a century later, they are now seen as icons of feminism. What makes flappers so iconic is not the partying and risque dresses, it's their blatant rejection of societal expectations. And then we get the central claim. 1920s flappers, there's the focus, are a significant part of feminist history. What was their impact, or what was their message? Who upset traditional gender roles through their consumerism and social engagement. What was the consequence of that? That gave women a new way to express and explore themselves. What's the larger significance of all this? In turn, flappers give us important insights about how gender equality and female empowerment can be achieved in our own time. Notice how that our own time relates to why is this significant now? You're writing a paper about a historical group. Why do they matter now? They answer that question. Why is this significant or important to think about now? They answer that question. I'm just going to bring in a flood of highlights here. And what this shows is that the majority of what's going on in this introduction is they're not giving a bunch of detailed background of flappers per se. They're talking about the context of the 1920s and feminine gender norms. Obviously, the social issue here has to do with feminine gender norms or feminine expectations, gender expectations. So they set up that issue. That's an issue we recognize that connects us to the paper. We understand what gender norms are. In many ways in our society, at least I would argue, we have still very conservative and traditional gender norms, though not as restrictive as they were perhaps in the 20s. So they do set up the issue, obviously, but the majority of the paragraph is talking about the context. What's going on in terms of this issue of gender norms in the 1920s? But this also connects to our current time. Not only do they say, during their time, most viewed flappers as promiscuous young ladies. However, a century later, we can now see them as icons of feminism, and they say that again in the central claim. Flappers give us important insights about how gender equality and female empowerment can be achieved in our own time. But this context is precisely what not only sets up the significance of their argument, but also connects the argument to, that significance comes from the argument being connected to the reader and them understanding like, oh yeah, gender norms, that's something that we're constantly talking about, thinking about, that's a social issue of our time and of our lives. So that's where the introduction, that's why the introduction is so sort of intricately connected to the central claim, because it's setting up the different pieces and showing, it's doing a sort of expanded version of it, but it's setting up a sense of significance through setting up context. It's introducing the social issue, it's introducing the focus, and then my central claim sort of takes all that information and puts it in one nice compact statement to represent my argument. Okay, I'm going to step out of the sharing my screen here, and I want to open it up. We're still recording here. At least I certainly hope we are. Sorry, let me get this thing figured out. Get out of PowerPoint here. It's blocking my screen. Okay, we are still recording, just so people are aware of that. But I wanted to open it up for questions, and then we can shut it down. So are there any questions either about what I just went through? Obviously, this PowerPoint will be uploaded to Canvas along with this recorded Zoom workshop. So that'll be available on Canvas if you want to go back through it. But if you wanted to look at that PowerPoint again or look at those examples, the PowerPoint will be up there this afternoon. I'll post it as soon as the video converts, which might take like an hour or something, but I'll post it today. So if you need it. But are there any questions about that, or about the class, or about the WD3 or anything like that while I still have you guys here? Oh, Marable, okay, let me open the chat window. Oh, Marable says no. Okay, well, cool. It's good to be, let me stop the recording.